All right, welcome back to the QX Financial Podcast, where I am joined by Phil Shekerlian. We are going to be talking 2020 election today, specifically the Joe Biden versus Donald Trump tax plans, what it's going to mean for you and your family, all that fun stuff. We're going to dive into it and take a closer look. And thank you, Phil, for joining us. Really excited to talk about this. It should be fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, and I'm excited as well. Hopefully, this provides some education for people to make their own decisions and not be led by their family or friends or whoever somebody else tells them to vote for.
Absolutely. The election's coming right up, and I believe we will have this video out before the election. So we'll be working busy on that, and it'll give you guys a chance to hear it, just the facts. We're not going to get into any biased opinions or partisan talk. We're just going to lay out what the candidates have told us. Phil has something really great for us today, so let's jump into it.
Yeah. So I think I'll start off with, what Biden has said that he wants to present as part of his tax proposal. Once again, like I said in our last video, this is stuff that is proposed. It is still, it may or may not have changed since I, read this information, and that without the help and cooperation of Congress, some of this may never happen anyhow. But these are what they have proposed at some point in time. So one of the things Biden has proposed is to increase the Social Security payroll tax on people of higher income earnings, those with 400,000 or more. Individuals with over 400,000 in income would have a higher payroll tax rate. The increase is said to be, depending on the tax bracket the person is in now, anywhere between a 2.6 to 4.6% increase. Additionally, Biden wants to raise corporate taxes to 28%. Currently, they are at 20% flat, 20 or 21. And he wants to raise them up to 20%. Mm-hmm. Now, I do want to give my opinion on this, and this is not an opinion on a candidate one way or the other, but having the higher corporate tax rate causes a lot of problems for businesses and causes a lot of businesses to leave the country. Mm-hmm. So if that is something that's a concern to you as a voter, that's something you should look more into, is to when companies leave for corporate tax rates. Mm-hmm. Additionally, Biden wants to put a temporary increase in for child independent credits. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed under the Trump administration in 2017, it eliminated some of these credits that were there previous. Mm-hmm. Biden has proposed to put those back in for whatever reason, temporarily, but not permanently. So mm-hmm. that is something that he has proposed. Mm-hmm. And additionally, speaking of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, he wants to eliminate the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and all of its provisions.
Right.
It would increase income taxes on most Americans. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act actually lowered the income tax for most of America, with the exception of California and New York, and there's some reasons for that, and I will get into that. It will increase taxes on small businesses, and it'll generate a lot more tax revenue to pay off some of the debt that we've had from coronavirus or whatever else the case may be.
Right.
Additionally, there is something in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act called a qualified opportunity zone. And that is a way for investors, and actually let me back up a step. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act actually eliminated the 1031 exchange, which is when you have an investment property, you can trade that investment property for another investment property without owing the capital gains taxes. You basically just shift them from one property to another. Well, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act eliminated that for everything except for real estate to real estate transactions. So by eliminating the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you would get that back to do between real estate and stocks or whatever the case may be. Gotcha. But the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act added in something to offset that 1031 exchange loss called the Qualified Opportunity Zone. And this was a two-purpose law. I'll get into it in more detail later, but basically if you invest money into a zone that is considered a low-income zone or a distressed zone where, you know, they could really use rebuilding and remodeling and making it a better community, you can actually eliminate a lot of your capital gains taxes. Well, you defer them for one, but you can also potentially eliminate a lot of them as well. So that's actually better than a 1031, but you know, that might end if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is repealed as well.
So that was the QOZ, the zoning investment opportunity that was placed in the TCJA. That was to replace the 1031 exchange, or those were just two things that were kind of traded off in that act?
I don't know if the intent was to replace the 1031, but it actually does replace that. And actually, it's better than a 1031 in a lot of circumstances.
Right, because it gets that investment into areas that could really use it. Is that kind of
absolutely for that reason, and because you're helping to eliminate taxes, not just defer them as well.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. And then, so I had mentioned earlier that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act decreased taxes for most of the U.S., but not so much for California and New York. And the reason being is something called a SALT tax.
Right.
And that stands for state and local taxes. For most people, that is the amount that you pay in state income tax and property taxes on your home. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of states don't have a state income tax, and a lot of states have low property tax for their real estate. And even if they don't, the real estate's not worth as much as it is in California and New York. So this limitation really only affected California and New York. And this limitation would be lifted if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is repealed, which is one of the things that Biden says. So if you're in California and New York, that's probably a great thing for you. If you're in the rest of the country, that means your taxes are probably going to go up. But not in every case. It's a case-by-case basis.
Sure. Yeah. And so Biden's plan doesn't directly increase the payroll taxes unless you're earning $400,000 or more. Is that correct?
That would be on the payroll taxes, yes.
On the payroll tax, okay.
The overall tax at the end of the year would go up if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is repealed.
Right. And was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that was also a temporary thing. Is there plans for Donald Trump to reinstate it going forward past, I think it was 2027 or 2030 it was supposed to expire?
Yeah, so it's 2026 is when it's supposed to expire. It's called sunsetting. And, you know, he's talked about keeping it, but once again, he's going to have consent of Congress if he remains in office to do that.
Right.
So whether it will or not, we really don't know. And, you know, Congress have to come up with a tax bill, or a tax plan on a regular basis. So it could even be changed before then, or you know, there's so many different possibilities. It's unknown, but as the law sits right now, that's what it is.
And it's good to know where the mindsets are of the candidates, at least at this point. That's all we have to go off of. So yeah, it's good that we're laying this all out for people.
In my industry, it's good to bet on an existing law rather than some law that a candidate or senator or representative thinks that they can get put into place.
Yeah, no, that's probably good practice.
So then some more from Biden's proposals is he wants to lower the estate tax threshold. So currently it is a little over $11.5 million a person right now. And what that means is that if you die with over this threshold amount of about $11.5 million per person, so if you're a couple, it's actually a little over $23 million, then that amount over the $23 million or $11.5 million, that would be taxed at a 40% tax rate. Mm-hmm. Now you also include lifetime gifts into that, but that's a whole nother topic that we'll go over in another video. Mm-hmm. But the proposal by Biden is to lower that amount to $3 million. So at the 11.5 million right now, you're talking about estate tax on really just the most ultra wealthy part of the U.S. Less than a percentage of the population has that kind of money.
Right.
If you lower it to 3 million, you're actually starting to include a lot of the middle class there. I think a good majority of my clients have at least $3 million worth of assets between real estate and life insurance and things along those lines. And 401ks. It's really quick and easy to get to that 3 million mark. And that would affect a lot of people.
Right. Especially in Orange County in California.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that's one of the ones you have your eye on as an estate planning professional.
It's funny because personally that would hurt me to have that go down that low. And I'm not a big fan of that. But however, if it went down that low, my business would probably triple because now I would have a lot of work trying to help people figure out how to minimize that estate tax for their kids.
Absolutely.
And their heirs.
Right.
So I'm conflicted on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Big one.
Another part of his proposal for Biden is that he would eliminate the step-up in basis. It's unclear how he would do that or to what extent, but basically what it seems like is that, and let me explain the step-up in basis. So when you have an asset and it grows in value, that growth is called capital appreciation. That capital appreciation is taxed in California here, both by the state and by the federal government, and many other states do as well. If somebody dies having an asset that capitally appreciated in their estate, which typically means in their name, but not always, if they have that in their estate, then all of those capital gains, the capital appreciation and the tax owed gets wiped out for the heirs. And the heirs inherit that asset with no capital gains owed, and the only capital gains they would ever owe is based on the growth from the time that they inherited it to the time they sold that asset. Does that make sense?
It does. And when we finish recording this and watching it, I'll make sure to watch that a couple times to make sure I really get it. But I think I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's called the step up in basis. So when a family member dies and leaves you property, you inherit that property with no capital gains taxes owed, and it's a great thing. So Biden's proposal is to eliminate that so that you would inherit that property with the capital gains taxes owed. It's unclear, but there's the potential that could be due upon the relative's death, which means, hey, here you inherited $1 million home, and also here's this $350,000 tax bill.
Right.
Or it could mean that no, at the time you sell it, that's when the tax bill is due. So that's unclear, but either of those two could be a potential.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that one yet. That's wow. That's big.
It could be, absolutely. Once again, that's going to be something that would make my business increase significantly.
Right.
A lot more planning involved to try to minimize the effects of that.
Yes, absolutely. It sounds like the Biden team has potentially made your job a lot more intensive with all these new laws and taxes. So
absolutely, and it's not just a Biden thing. That is a typical for every election. Whether if the Republicans control the White House and Congress, taxes are typically lower, and my business planning isn't as high. And if it's Democrat controlled, then business is great for me, and there's a lot more taxes to get around. That's just the typical cycle.
The typical flow, exactly. I was just going to say that. Yep.
And then the last part of Biden's proposal that I'm aware of is that he wants to lower the taxes for retirees. One of the things that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did was it generates quite a bit of tax revenue from inherited retirement accounts. So if you have a IRA, 401k, 403b, any type of qualified account that's pre-tax dollars, and you die with that account and your kids inherit it, and actually this wasn't the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, this was the Secure Act, which was passed, I believe that was 2019, December 2019. And that basically said that the taxes to the heirs are much higher than they were before, unless that heir is a spouse.
Right.
or disabled or a couple other small exemptions. But for the most part, it's much higher.
Hmm.
And so I think Biden's plan would seek to counteract that by lowering tax. Well, he may eliminate that entirely as well. I haven't heard that, but he could
Right.
also counteract that by lowering the taxes for retirees,
Hmm.
therefore allowing them to withdraw more during their lifetime, and then the kids or heirs don't have to worry about the taxes upon inheritance.
Right. And that's a big thing in our business as well. When we talk to people, we always tell them you don't want to leave an IRA or a 401k to your kids. You always want to leave them life insurance because you don't have that tax liability to worry about, and the laws that go along with
Absolutely.
that can be quite confusing and quite costly. So,
Yep. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail later in this video, but there are some great planning opportunities utilizing life insurance and some other things that can absolutely, like you said, reduce not only reduce the amount of tax exposure, but actually help your kids profit even more than they would have otherwise.
yeah,
So I'll
for
get
sure.
into that in a bit. Um, so Trump's plan is a lot of the same for the most part. From what I can tell, his goal is to increase jobs and end reliance on China. He wants to continue the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, um, doesn't want it repealed, would potentially seek to extend it past the sunset of 2026. That, just a refresher, that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it lowers taxes across the board for most states, but penalizes California and New York.
Hmm.
It has new ways to reduce capital gains through their qualified opportunity zones.
Hmm.
And something else I forgot to mention, it gives and actually it lowered the corporate taxes to the 20% rate, and it also gives a 20% tax deduction to small businesses. And this is actually important.
Hmm.
So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act really helped small businesses. For those people that have a pass-through type entity that aren't subject to that corporate tax rate, they could be subject to much higher taxes. And so what this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did is it allowed a 20% deduction for these small businesses. So let's say a small business earns $100,000, then they get and they qualify for this deduction, which most of them do.
Hmm.
Then they get a 20% cut off of that. So now their gross income is seen as more like 80,000. And then from there, they take their actual deductions. And then from there, they calculate their tax owed.
Hmm.
So that has actually been really beneficial to a lot of small businesses. And I'm going to imagine that after this year, with how much small businesses have been hurt by COVID, that's going to be a huge sigh of relief at tax time for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's big.
Um, and then, like I had mentioned before, he did pass that Secure Act, which increased the taxes on inherited qualified plans, and he would seek to keep that going as well.
Okay.
As far as changes to the tax plan, um, I don't know how serious he is, but he has talked about, well, it's not how serious he is, how much cooperation he can get, is that he has talked about one of the parts of the CARES Act, which was the coronavirus changes that were made this year to help people, the stimulus checks and things along those lines.
Hmm.
Part of the CARES Act was to defer payroll taxes in part of this year.
Yes.
But it was just deferral. So essentially, your employer, when they pay you, they're not taking out these payroll taxes. They're taking out federal and state, but not the payroll portion.
Hmm.
And then you get to keep that money. And the original plan was at the end of the year, when you file your taxes in January, February, March, April, whenever you do before April like 15th,
Hmm.
then you would have to pay that back.
Right.
Well, one of Trump's proposals is to defer all of that back tax owed and just let you keep that money.
Right.
Additionally, capital gains tax. Historically, capital gains taxes are pretty low right now.
Yeah.
There's actually a ladder system, just like income taxes, to determine how much you owe federally for capital gains.
Hmm.
In California, it's different. It's taxed as ordinary income, so it's no different than if you made that money as a paycheck.
Right.
But federally, the rates are either 0, 15, or 20%. So there's actually a portion of the population, the lower class and people that don't make as much, that they can actually sell capitally appreciated asset, and whether or not they had a step up in basis, they can pay zero federal capital gains tax. So that's a great tool for the lower class and for the not as well off.
Right.
For the majority of the population, though, you're talking about that 15% rate, which is really low historically. And then for the top class and for assets that are really high value that are sold, you're talking about paying 20% capital gains tax, still relatively low in the history. So Trump's plan is to reduce that top bracket to 15% or less, and then adjust the bottom brackets accordingly.
Right.
Yeah. And then finally, to figure out, he hasn't said a specific way to do this, just a general idea that he wants to reduce tax rates to the middle class as well.
Right. So a lot of tax cuts on the one hand, a little bit of tax increases on the other hand, and around and round we go every 4 years.
Absolutely.
On that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then as far as foreign policy, he does want to increase future tariffs. He increased tariffs quite a bit throughout his term, and I think I read that he generated around $80 billion already in additional foreign tariff taxes, and he wants to stretch that even further.
Right.
So I think that, and he wants to potentially penalize companies that are American companies operating overseas because of the high corporate tax rates that were in place before he got into office, and they moved out of the country for their operation. He wants to penalize them if they don't come back to the U.S. as well.
Yeah, I think that's a huge one. I think that both sides should be able to agree on is the practice of moving headquarters overseas and avoiding the taxes that should be due in our country. Unfortunately, companies have been getting away with that for a while, and so hopefully something can be done on that for sure.
Yep. So that summarizes their two tax plans as I know it as of the date that I put this together. I want to talk a little bit about planning. So
definitely,
no matter which candidate gets into office, whether they have cooperation from Congress or not, there are some things that people can do to plan and make sure they pay the least amount of taxes possible. You can't avoid taxes. You can't skirt your duty to pay taxes, but there are a lot of provisions that allow you to minimize how much taxes you pay.
Yes.
And a lot of that can only be done through proper planning. So right now under the current tax laws, only about 95% or so of the population really only needs a basic planning. And that basic planning can be anywhere from, for me to provide it to you and your family, can be anywhere from $1,200 to $3,000 for that basic planning. However, if you start getting into, some of these higher tax issues where the estate tax goes down or the exemption amount goes down,
Sure.
Capital gains taxes go up or income taxes go up or whatever the case may be, then you're starting to talk a little more advanced tax planning. And that can range, anywhere from $4,000 or $5,000 to $50,000 for that type of planning. So it just depends on what the tax climate is to do the planning, but there is planning available for all situations.
Right. That's good.
Something to keep in mind is timing. So whether the Congress converts to 100% Republican and Trump stays in office and you have a Republican minority or majority or unanimously controlling, or you have the Democrats take over the entire Congress and White House. Either way, if there's tax changes that are proposed, those changes aren't going to happen until next year.
Right.
But just because they happen next year doesn't mean that they cannot be retroactive. And typically what happens is those laws are passed retroactive to January 1st of that particular year. So if a new president is sworn in January and Biden starts working with Congress and they're super quick about it, and in February they pass a new tax law, that law will more than likely be retroactive to January 1st.
Right.
Well, anything before January 1st can actually be grandfathered in. So if you put tax plans into place under the current law and they change the current law, your tax plan will still protect you because it was done before January 1st and put into place.
Right.
So, if you think that the results of this election are going to affect you, whether, it's Biden or Trump or Congress changes hands or stays the same or whatever the case may be, you really need to get that planning done, in place, signed, and completed before December 31st to take advantage of the laws as they are now, because the laws are really, really favorable right now. There's so much that can be done, and for so relatively easy to plan for taxes.
Right. No, that's a really important point. I just wanted to hammer on that. We're filming this in the middle of October. The election is in a couple weeks. It's going to happen so quick. We're not even going to know what happens. So please talk to a planning professional, tax planning professional, financial professional ASAP. Make sure you are prepared for whatever is going to happen, because it's very important.
Absolutely. And be prepared. A lot of people, everybody I talk to says, well, let me see, we don't really need the tax planning right now, but if the election changes things, then we'll need it, and we'll come in at that point in time. And I can't tell
you
too late how many hundreds of clients I have heard that from in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And if that does come to fruition, I'm going to be swamped, and every tax professional is going to be swamped from election day until December 31st. And it may be difficult to get in and see someone.
Yeah.
And if you can, there's probably going to be a surcharge in prices because work has to be contracted out. New employees need to be hired, things along those lines. And it may be challenging to get it done at the last minute. So as soon as you possibly can, get that started.
Yeah. Never too early.
Yeah. And if you would like our office to help you out with that, we do all types of planning, business, tax, estate, probate, trust admin, asset protection planning. If you want us to help you out with any of that, call us. We will do a free consultation and see what you can do to take advantage of the laws as they are now, or the laws as they may become in the future.
Very cool. We will put your information in the box below, so check that out.
Excellent. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right. Take care. The commentary provided in this video is for informational and educational purposes only. No advice, offer, or solicitation of any kind, expressed or implied, is being given. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of QX Financial, any subsidiaries, or associates thereof. When considering making any changes to your situation, you should consult a competent licensed professional. All rights reserved. Copyright September 17th, 2020.
This information is not intended and should not be taken as legal advice for any particular set of facts or circumstances. You should contact an attorney directly for advice with specific legal problems. None of this information creates an attorney-client relationship with the law offices of Phil Shekerlian.